Hey, thanks for joining. You did it. Nice job. Introducing our project management trainer, speaker, author, and coach to thousands of professionals and organizations worldwide, including NASA, the U.S. Air Force, USACE, U.S. Army, the Department of Transportation, the FBI. Your friend, Phil. Over to you, Phil.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to our PMP Exam Daily Drill for today. Today, we're going to take a look at the topic of communication. One of our students sent in this question requesting to understand the difference between the different communication types. So let's take a look at communication basics. Now, what is communications? To understand communications, you should first take a look at the basic communications model. In the basic communications model, we have a sender who encodes a message. In other words, translates ideas into a language or symbols so that the other party, the receiver, can understand what the sender wants to convey in the message. The receiver decodes the message, comes to a level of understanding, and through the medium, despite the noise and the barriers, the receiver encodes what we call a feedback message. And this feedback message will be decoded by the sender. The feedback message should be an assurance that the message has been understood. Now, as you can see on the screen, we have the element of noise. Noise is anything that affects the receipt, the understanding, the comprehension of the message. Now, in the PMBok guide, we talk about various barriers to communication. We're going to take a look at a few of these barriers to communications. So, whenever you need to overcome these barriers to effective communication, be aware that some of it is due to the emotional state of the individual sending the message or receiving. Some of it is due to the generation of the person receiving or sending the message. So, to overcome these barriers, the sender needs to effectively state a message, minimizing potential communication blockers. If there's anything that could hamper or hinder the message, it should be removed from the communications. The receiver needs to effectively listen, accurately perceive the message, provide affirmation and feedback. And as I said, there's several inhibitors, we call them communication blockers, that can prevent this from happening. Some additional ones are lack of concentration, interruptions, preconceived ideas, thinking ahead instead of being in the moment and listening, interference and tuning out. So, differences in meaning, lack of trust, those are also potential barriers or blockers. How about information overload? Missing information. Turn to page 15. It ended at 10. Interference, being condescending, poor listening skills, premature judgments, and inaccurate assumptions. Now, our student went ahead to ask the question, what does it mean when we say formal communication or informal communications? So let's take a look at these two. Formal communications. What exactly does it mean when we say communication is formal? It means the communication is done in accordance with rules of convention or etiquette, suitable for or constituting an official or important situation or occasion. So for this, you need to think about importance. You need to think about being in an official setting, like a work setting. It is not casual. It is done in such a way that it represents the company or the body that is involved with the communications. Let's take a look at our next definition. Our next definition is informal. What does informal mean? It's a style of communicating in writing or conversational speech characterized by simple grammatical structures, familiar vocabulary, and use of idioms, sometimes in a relaxed, friendly, or unofficial style. Now that we've defined formal and informal, let's take a look at some examples of these communication types. Let's first talk about formal communication. So, examples of formal communication: formal papers, letter to a college, a resume, or a cover letter for a job. Now, mining even deeper to talk about formal communication. Formal communication does not always have to be done in a physical medium. There could be formal communication even when spoken. For example, in a lecture, you would expect a formal type of language to be used. In a job interview, when you are presenting information to executives, you would expect formal communication to be used. There's also formal communication that is nonverbal. For example, you're sitting down in a lecture hall with professors, or you're interacting with customers. Your body language, your poise would be of a formal nature. When you are shaking hands to greet a customer, that is a type of nonverbal formal communication. So communication does not always have to be written before we say it is formal. Now let's take a look at some of the communication that could be termed as informal. Examples of informal communication, the one we all know, social media. Social media is very informal. People use casual language. It's not official, very relaxed. Emails, another example, even though there could be formal emails as well, but informal emails, we've got a lot of examples of emails to and fro family members, to friends, and things such as that. Websites could often contain informal communications. That is not to say they couldn't have formal communication. Also, informal communication could be ad hoc. We could have ad hoc communication, unplanned discussions. We could also have talking with colleagues on the phone. Now, I'd like to go back to those images just to show you through a picture what informal communication could look like. You've got friends having an informal conversation over coffee, over lunch. On the flip side, when we talk about a formal communication setting, you can see an individual addressing a large group of people. That is an example of formal communication through a picture. Going a step further, in addition to these definitions of communication being formal and informal, we also need to talk about electronic communication and physical communication. This was another question from our student. So when we talk about electronic communication, we're talking about any transfer of signs, signals, writing, images, sounds, data, or intelligence of any nature, transmitted in whole or in part by a wire, radio, electromagnetic, photoelectronic, or photo-optical system. We could be talking about email, we could be talking about phone calls, we could even be talking about messages transmitted with the component of visualization through a webcam and things such as that. The other definition is physical communication. It is a form of communication where symbols, signs, and gestures are used. Unlike verbal communication, which involves the use of sound and the ear for hearing, physical communication involves the use of the eyes for seeing and other parts of the body for gesturing. So, my friends, I hope this has helped you to better understand certain dimensions around the aspect of communications. Now, going back to the communication model, I would like to call your attention to a few more pieces of communications. There's written, there's oral. When we take a look at the basic communication model, it is important to realize that this does not just pertain to oral communication or spoken communication. This could also pertain to written communication. Now, when we take a look at written communication and oral communication and take a look at the model, you got to remember the way you write your ideas down, the way you compose an email it could have noise in it if it isn't well composed and if it isn't transparent to the receiver. So whether you are writing or whether you are speaking, you must remember to properly encode your ideas, translate your ideas into a written message or spoken message such that the receiver can understand. When we talk about written communication, it always has permanent record, and we need to be very careful. And when we say written, we don't mean written physically by hand, but when we say written, we mean it is in print. It could be in email, it could be on a memo, it could be in some form where it is printed without you necessarily having to write it out. That is what we mean by written communication. Written communication is high cost. It's a record. It can be used as legal evidence. It also takes time to write and give feedback. Written communication could sometimes, not all the time, be very rigid or inflexible. Written communication takes more time to prepare. As people often say, talk is cheap. They say talk is cheap because you could say anything, and the price for what you say, if it is not recorded, is not very high. But the price of what is on paper, what is written, could be very high, especially when there's legal incidents that communication is used as evidence. Written communication is typically easy to understand when well put together. When well put together, it's hard to distort that message. But when it's not well put together, it becomes easier to distort. So it is important that when you talk about written communication, you got to remember some of the advantages. If you really want to put a contract together, the best thing to do is use written communication. For non-contractual communication, you could use oral communication. But in the world of the PMI, it is also important to realize that even verbal agreements, because we are who we are, bound by the code of ethics, whatever we communicate verbally should be looked at as an agreement. So the world of communications is very wide and vast. There's a lot to be spoken about. But very quickly, when we say oral communication could be very effective because this is how tacit knowledge is communicated, things that people find hard to understand. As opposed to putting it in writing, we talk it over and people come away understanding whatever needs to be conveyed a lot better. Oral communications is obviously very flexible. It enables people to give immediate feedback, and in instances where we are speaking one to another, under most circumstances, it is right then and there in the moment. So it becomes easy to talk to each other rapidly and solve any problems. Back in the day, there used to be questions on these mock exams that ask, what is the best way to convey a difficult concept? And the answer was typically, if you put it in writing, it's hard to misconstrue. But at the same time, if you have a difficult concept, you also need to be open to discussing it, because sometimes tacit knowledge will always be conveyed best when you have people in the same room where the body language is very transparent, where you can hear, where you can see. That is one of the best ways. So that makes the exam even more tricky. And for that reason, you really need to understand communications, physical, electronic, oral, and otherwise. I would say for those of you taking the exam, definitely read every line in your PMBok guide, okay? This is just to call your attention to a lot of the little nuances in the PMBok guide that I would definitely recommend that you master before your exam. Thank you for joining me, and all the very best.